All right, if I could have folks' attention, it is my great pleasure to welcome us to day 2 of our annual conference. As I've said before, this conference is a little bit like a family reunion or an ongoing conversation over time. And once you're part of this community, a little like the Hotel California, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. We hope you can never leave in the sense of you catch what is probably apocryphally referred to as Niwat's curse, which is that Chief Niwat cast a curse on land, and those who come here are doomed either to never want to leave or to won't want to keep coming back. We are so grateful to have Chairwoman Edith Ramirez here for a second year in a row. As I've said, she's incredibly substantive, engaged, very much of the type of an FTC chairwoman we at Silicon Flatirons enjoy and respect. She's been taking in the conference, and this is something that you really admire in government officials, and we've had now our third FTC chair who has done this, who's really stayed engaged and been a part of the conversation. John Leibowitz has been here before, as has Bill Kovacic, and we're now thrilled to have Chairwoman Ramirez. We're also so fortunate to have Paul Ohm, who spent a year at the FTC and who's been really a heart and soul in all we're doing. So with that, I will turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, Phil, and welcome back. Thank you for joining us. It's my privilege to say welcome back for the first time. As Phil says, you're a repeat player. I do want to spend about 30 seconds just highlighting what is a really long and interesting biography, and I, again, commend the details to you. So Chairwoman Ramirez became a commissioner in April 2010 of the Federal Trade Commission and was named by President Obama the chairwoman of the agency in March 2013. This happened to be the time when I was at the agency as a senior policy advisor, and I got to witness the transition from John Leibowitz to Edith Ramirez, and I saw two really remarkable civil servants running a very remarkable civil agency, a law enforcement agency that takes great pride in what they do, that has a wonderful track record, and under Chairwoman Ramirez's leadership has really continued and in many ways expanded the interesting and amazing work they do at the forefront of consumer protection and competition policy. The New York Times did a recent write-up on Chairwoman Ramirez's activities in the healthcare space and called her precise, astute, and quietly forceful, which I think is a really apt description for much of what I respect so much in the chairwoman. So it's really my pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you. Let me lay down the ground rules for the audience. I'm going to ask as many of these questions as I can get in, and I'm going to reserve some time at the end for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. And so without further ado, let's kind of kick it off. So welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Paul. Let me just say that I'm really delighted to be back. I'm here at Silicon Flatirons, and in particular, love the tremendous weather that you're having here. Yes. I feel like I'm back in Southern California. So thank you, Phil, for the invitation to come back, and Paul for the opportunity to have this conversation with you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. So let's start. And yesterday I referred to buzz phrase bingo. And I want to give some substance to one of the buzz phrases that's heard a lot these days, which is the Internet of Things. So tomorrow, I think, will be 2 weeks from when the FTC put out a really, really interesting staff report on building security in the Internet of Things. Again, for the students in the audience, I really commend this to you. It's very readable, full of lots of sensible advice. And even though this is a buzz phrase, I heard the commission talking about this 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and I heard you personally talking about this. So now that we've had the benefit of a workshop, now that the staff has written its report, that the commission has issued, what have you learned about the Internet of Things? What's your latest thinking on why this is an important issue, and what are some of the sub-issues within it that we should be thinking about?
One of the characteristics of the agency has been our ability to really stay at the forefront of issues that impact consumers. And when I became chairwoman, the Internet of Things was something that we saw as an emerging area, and we knew that it was important for the agency to take a very close examination of what was going to be happening in that field. We held a workshop. We've received public comments. We've been engaging with industry, consumer advocates, technologists, academics on these issues, and we did issue a report a couple of weeks ago. Let me also start by saying that we have a mission to advance consumer welfare. We have a competition mission as well as the consumer protection mission, and as part of that, we also really want to see innovation. We want to promote innovation. We want to encourage new business models. We want to see all these terrific new products and services that are that we see today. But at the same time, we want to make sure that that takes place and that those flourish without sacrificing consumer protection, without sacrificing privacy, without sacrificing security. So that was really one of the overarching objectives as well behind the report that we issued. So in our report, we want to acknowledge all of the tremendous potential that the Internet of Things can have, and but at the same time recognizing all of that tremendous potential and the tremendous benefits that can be provided to consumers. We also want to highlight certain risks that we see that have been heightened as a result of this new emerging area, the Internet of Things, where people are bringing in connected devices to their homes, to their workplaces, their cars are connected. And let me talk a little bit about what some of the risks that I see as being crucial in this area. And of course, I had the opportunity to go to Las Vegas a few weeks ago to CES to see some of these new technologies that we're going to be soon, that are either in the marketplace or will soon be in the marketplace. So you have smart appliances, you have smart cutlery, will monitor the amount of calories that you're consuming, et cetera. Let me hone in on one particular device, just by way to illustrate some of the issues that I want to talk about. A smart bed. A smart bed, and that what it really means is it's a mattress cover that has hundreds of sensors that are embedded in it, and these sensors collect and monitor your heart rate, your temperature, your respiration. Even has a microphone that will pick up when you're snoring. So you can see that there are all these potential benefits, right? It can automatically heat the sheets if you're cold, and as a Californian who's had to endure East Coast winters, that sounds, like a great, very appealing and a great convenience. This smart bed can also be integrated with other devices in your home, including your thermostat, the lights, the locks, and so all of that can be adjusted remotely. And the information that's being collected is transmitted into an app on your smartphone. So again, we can see that there's a lot of potential, a lot of great convenience. It can also provide valuable information. We all know that sleep is crucial to overall health, so there are lots of benefits here. But at the same time, it raises some concerns when it comes to both privacy and security. Let me elaborate on three things that I think are most important. One is ubiquitous data collection. Because we're bringing these devices, again, into what used to be very private spaces, a lot of the information that's being collected today is much more sensitive. Again, I delineated what it's going to be monitoring, again, your heart rate, respiration, et cetera. You can imagine all of the various pieces of information that can be gleaned from this information, not only when you're home, when you go to sleep, et cetera. So that's something that we have to look at very closely. Secondly, the amount of data that we are now generating, the volume has just increased exponentially. And so what that means is that even if the data that's being collected is otherwise seemingly benign or innocuous, the fact that we now have these very rich data sets means that you can also make very sensitive inferences from that data that's being collected. So that issue, that the ubiquitous data collection that's taking place is sort of one dimension of this. Now, the next question that arises and follows from that data collection is the increased potential for unexpected uses of that information. Clearly, we all know that this information, take another example, just fitness bands that we see everywhere today. We all know that we have access to that information to help us be more healthy, to be more fit. But I think a consumer would be surprised if they learned that that information was being transmitted to a third party, was potentially being sold to a data broker who may then combine that information with other offline and other online information and aggregate it. And what data brokers are doing today, and we also issued a report in the last year on the data broker industry, they're compiling these very detailed dossiers about virtually every single one of us. One of the largest data brokers has profiles of nearly, approximately 900 million people. The number's probably much higher today. So what is happening with that data? There's a tremendous lack of transparency. Consumers don't really fully understand how that information, what information is the scope of what is being collected, and how it's being used, whether it's being shared with third parties and used for marketing or other purposes. Now, and of course, these when you aggregate all this information about us, it really can present a very detailed profile about all of us that include, and data brokers do this. They compile information, they actually segment consumers based on age, ethnicity, income, health conditions, all sorts of information. And again, that raises important questions that we have to think hard about.
So if I can ask a follow-up then on that. So one of the kind of prescriptions, best practices in the report speaks of data minimization as something that you would expect an Internet of Things vendor to consider and to implement. Of course, the devil's going to be the details. It surprised me. I felt like there was more criticism and backlash to this staff report than I'm used to seeing from an FTC staff report. I mean, there was tons of praise as well, but particularly this point about data minimization got highlighted as, I guess, to try and characterize the critique as out of touch with the benefits. The idea seems to be, of course, we should be able to know everything about you we can from your smart bed, because we're going to come up with all sorts of wonderful things that we can't even imagine today. And so, I mean, what do you think about these criticisms, and do you stand, or do you think the staff kind of was onto something with data minimization?
So there's this current debate right now about these issues, right? I mean, on one side, you have, I think, a significant number of people who are of this mindset that you ought to collect everything, because they're focusing on the tremendous potential from these immense data sets. Big data can really offer a lot. We now have so much data that you can really glean all of this very valuable information about how to streamline processes, and ultimately to the benefit of consumers, and can further create more efficiencies, lead to more innovation, which is all, I think, accurate. There's tremendous potential, no question about that, and we absolutely recognize that. But at the same time, I think that this mindset of collect everything, that more data is always better, is something that we at the FTC and I want to challenge. I don't think that that's the right approach to take. And one of the reasons is that there are a number of, in addition to the privacy issues, there are also a number of security issues that arise, and that's the third risk that I want to talk about. And this was discussed during the course of yesterday's first panel as well. Sure. The fact that a number of the devices that we have in our homes have security flaws. So now imagine a world where you're bringing how many different devices into your home, each of which can have multiple sensors. As I mentioned, the smart bed has hundreds of sensors, and can then create more exposure for attackers to seek entry points and then use these devices to access your network, attack others. So those are very serious concerns. So to me, it's really important for the developers who are getting into this space to really think very hard about data minimization. Do you really need to collect all the information? Be aware of what you're collecting, number one. Number two, think hard about what information you really need in order to provide the functionality that you want to deliver to your consumer. If you do feel that you need the information, how long do you need to retain that information? So all of these issues are really important. And let me elaborate a little bit more on the data security dimension, because I think that's really incredibly important here. One of the unique challenges of the Internet of Things is that you have a huge number of new entrants, and you noted this earlier, that articles that we've seen about how startups aren't thinking about security, and they say, oh, we'll think about that later. We can't be thinking about that later. We need to think. We are recommending to startups and others that are entering this marketplace, they need to think about security at the very beginning. It's what we call security by design. You need to really assess these risks from the very beginning, determine, again, what information do you really need, how long do you need to retain it, with whom are you sharing it. All of these issues need to be addressed at the outset, and there needs to be just more conscious and more mindful gathering of information, not just indiscriminate collection.
Mm-hmm. And part of the dissent that I've seen, some of the criticism was that maybe the staff shouldn't even be promulgating anything called a best practice, that that's something that industry folks should do, talking amongst themselves, but that in the context of a workshop and a staff report, maybe that's not the proper role for the agency. Now, I know there's a long tradition of doing this in staff reports. I mean, do you have a specific reaction to that criticism?
Yeah, I think some people will say, look, this is an emerging area. Yeah. Do you really know enough in order to be making these recommendations? And what we've done in our report, we make best practices recommendations. That include an emphasis on data security. It also includes data minimization recommendation, as well as what we call simplified notice and choice, meaning that there needs to be more transparency provided to consumers so that they can understand and have more control over their information and be given options for how information is used, what information is collected, and whether it's shared or not with third parties. And that becomes much more important when you're dealing with sensitive information. So there is this critique that we ought not to do anything here because it's such an emerging area that you need to see how it plays out in the marketplace. I don't think that that's the right way to approach it. I mean, first of all, as an agency, we have been looking at these issues for a very long time. We've been looking at data security. And what we've seen in the marketplace is that there's not enough attention that's being placed on data security. When you then look at the Internet of Things and you see the unique risks and the heightened security risks that it poses, then I think that we're very well positioned to be making these recommendations. We've also taken the time, as I mentioned earlier, we've taken in public comments. We are, as an agency, my fellow commissioners and I are regularly meeting with companies and talking to them about how to deal with these issues and the challenges that they face. So as a commission, I think that we really work very hard to take a balanced approach to these complicated questions about how do you end up protecting consumer privacy, consumer information in our data-driven, connected world. And I think that we have taken great care in the recommendations that we put out. And in fact, we made a point of saying we're not recommending Internet of Things specific legislation. I nonetheless think that in our report, a majority of the commission does support baseline privacy legislation, and we have a unanimous commission that supports data security legislation. So we do make these other recommendations, but we've said we don't feel it's appropriate at this time to recommend IoT-specific legislation. So I think that we're both informed and that we know enough about the risks and that we are in a good position to be making best practice recommendations to those who are in the marketplace. And I think this is all very much supported and consistent with what we're reading about every day in the newspapers about some new breach. Today, as a matter of fact, Senator Markey has issued a report about the risks with connected cars. So there's more and more information that we learn, and in my mind, it just reinforces what we're advocating.
Yeah, so let me ask you a question then about data security, and you brought it up several times. And so it's amazing that whenever I go around speaking about privacy really what the audience wants to talk about is the latest data breach. And I know you're probably not in a position to talk about specific breaches. I will say that the Anthem breach has hit home here because Anthem is one of the larger insurers for University of Colorado employees. So I've been getting a lot of nervous email from colleagues in the last couple of days. But of course, we have Sony Pictures and JP Morgan Chase, and Target is still a memory in all of our minds. I was just wondering if you could update us on the agency's approach. You know, data security seems to be something that the agency for many years has been expanding its reach and footprint. Are there trends? Are there things changing in the way the agency is handling these data security cases?
You know, we've been very consistent in the approach that we take with regard to data security. We really advocate reasonableness as the touchstone. Section 5 requires that companies put in place reasonable security measures to protect information. So again, it's this very flexible approach. Companies that are collecting personal information need to take into account the volume, the sensitivity of the information that they're collecting. They need to assess the risks and then put procedures in place to mitigate those risks. We also think it's incredibly important to make sure that, again, depending on the size of a particular company, that there be someone who's responsible for thinking about these issues so that there can be accountability. So that approach has been, I think, consistent over time. What we have done is that we've been looking at different industries as we bring enforcement actions to make sure that we alert different segments of the risks here. So for instance, when it comes to the Internet of Things, back in the fall of 2013, we brought a case involving a company with connected security cameras. Again, we wanted to point out the danger in that particular case due to some security vulnerabilities. The live feed, 700 live feeds were placed online, and this showed, young kids, people in their homes. I mean, you can imagine all of the things that might have been displayed if your home security camera ends up being hacked, and then that feed ends up being placed online. So a few things there. I mean, again, security is crucially important. This issue of consumer trust, I mean, the families who were affected by that, I mean, you can imagine that they're going to be quite reluctant to be purchasing connected devices because of these dangers. So yesterday there was some discussion about the importance of consumer trust. Right. That's also really important. Let me throw in another point that was discussed yesterday as well, and that's economic incentives. And this is another issue that makes the Internet of Things marketplace particularly challenging, and that's that the economic incentives may not be in place to get companies to really pay the requisite attention. Some devices are very, not only are they small, they might be inexpensive, almost disposable. So another thing that we really encourage startups that are in this marketplace, think about the entire life cycle of a particular device, because if a device has low computing power, what's the ability to be able to, if there is a vulnerability that's uncovered, how will you be able to patch that vulnerability? How can you deploy it? If a consumer, how often does a consumer change a thermostat? Right? I mean, all of these issues really present some very unique challenges, and I think we're just getting our hands around that. And that's why it's so important for us as an agency, I think, to be talking about these things before the market is fully deployed, right? As these, in these emerging areas, because our goal is precisely to influence rather than to simply wait until the harm takes place and then retroactively, then after the fact, go after the conduct.
Yeah. So then one more question on kind of some of the data issues that the agency has been exploring. I think it was in the great state of Colorado, you gave a speech in Aspen where you connected big data to concerns about discrimination. It's certainly something that privacy scholars have been wrestling with for 2 or 3 years. I haven't heard, you were one of the first public officials I heard talking about it. So again, what should we be thinking about? And I'll confess, privacy scholars are of no kind of clear consensus on this, and we're all pretty confused, quite frankly. But what should we be thinking about when we think about particularly the kind of data broker, data handling you talked about, and discrimination, however we want to define that. Is this something that you're concerned about, that the agency is thinking about, and what, to speak to us about what we should be thinking about as well?
Sure. This is another area, again, I don't want to sound too pessimistic. We're highlighting some of the risks that I think we need to look at, but I want to make sure that everyone understands that we at the agency absolutely fully appreciate all of the benefits that big data has the potential to provide. But at the same time, we also have to just understand that there are certain risks, both on the privacy side as well as on the discrimination side. And I have talked about this, and let me also say that we're, I think, still at an early stage. We're still trying to really understand what is happening, but these are problems that I think are important to highlight so that companies can, again, increase their awareness and think hard about them. But let me explain what the issue is. We talked about the data broker report, and we talked about how consumers are being segmented depending on their income, ethnicity, race, where they live. One question that arises is, well, what are the consequences of that? Are all of these factors, and the fact that I'm segmented in a particular, placed in a particular category, is that going to affect the pricing that I see when I seek to buy something online? And the reality is that today, the more personalized the online experience becomes, it's like it's not just one internet experience, right? It's each of us having a different experience, seeing different prices. And of course, the White House issued a report last week on differential pricing. It can oftentimes be pro-competitive. But again, just questions that we need to be asking about what the consequences are. So there's, excuse me, issues about pricing, but also issues about, if I'm low income, what kind of offers am I receiving? What kind of, credit offers will I be getting? What level of customer service am I going to get if I'm placed in a category where a company may see me as being, not a great prospect as a consumer? So these are just important questions that we need to be thinking hard about. Let me also give you just another example. LaTanya Sweeney was our prior chief technologist. She's done some research in this area. And one example, we held a workshop on this topic in the fall. One example that she gave is of searches that she conducted where she was conducting searches using common African American names, including her own name. And when she ran these searches, she saw that there was 25% more likelihood that you would see an ad relating to an arrest record for those common African American names. 25% more likely than if you used a common, traditionally white name. So, again, what are the consequences for someone who is looking for a job? If someone runs a search on their name and then there's this suggestion or implication that they might have been arrested. So regardless of whether or not the person was arrested, there's this implication. What are the consequences of this? So I think we need to be just mindful that the fact that you have all these vast data sets, we need to remember correlation doesn't mean equal causation, that there may be these inherent biases in the data that companies need to be mindful of. Let me just give one example where this can be, these biases can be addressed, and it's one that was cited in a White House report that was issued last year that also touched this topic. In Boston, the city decided to issue to its residents an app to help them deal with the problem of potholes. So they issued this app, and the app would be able to monitor and sense when there was a pothole, and that way the city would be able to better and more efficiently address that problem. But they also recognized that the data that they would likely be receiving by giving this app out to its residents would likely be skewed in favor of more affluent areas. So recognizing that, what they then did was to also issue the app to city inspectors who would be traveling around the entire city to supplement the data that was being provided by the residents. and that way they seek to correct any inherent biases. So I think we're still very early in this process of ascertaining what the possible implications are of the way that we use big data. But what we want to do and what we are endeavoring to do, both with our workshop and additional work that we seek to do in this area, is to just bring awareness to the issue, to make sure that people understand that data can be used and can have many pro-competitive beneficial uses, but there might be some biases in there that we have to be careful and that we guard against so that we don't end up reinforcing existing disparities, existing inequalities, and how do we guard against that? How do we ensure that big data ends up being a tool that benefits everyone, that it becomes a tool for economic inclusion and not economic exclusion? So those are the issues that we're
and a quick follow-up, and the Sweeney study, it's a really, really salient example, and again, the scholars really talk about that one quite a bit. But just to spell out what I think is implied, the anonymous search engine with massive market share that Sweeney used would certainly say that this is not human agency. No engineer went in and said African American name equals ad for arrest records, and in fact the advertisers wouldn't have done that either. This was probably algorithmic, right?
So again, and so it's these seemingly neutral algorithms that yet may have disparate impact. And again, it's calling attention to the issue, asking companies to think about what the results might, the implications of certain results. So again, I think early on we're still trying to understand what's really happening. But one thing that we need to do is to start asking these important questions and we will need to develop norms around these issues eventually and develop an ethics of big data, et cetera. So again, we're just raising the issue, and we're going to continue to do work in this area.
So let's move on to a different set of topics. And as you probably know from wandering around the receptions at this conference the last couple of days, you can throw a rock in any direction and probably hit a telecom lawyer in this room. I'm not advising you do that. I'm teaching my students the Brandenburg incitement test today. I'm not asking you to throw rocks in here. But one thing I've noted in the FTC, particularly in the docket of the last year, is the kind of the mobile and mobile app movement of the agency, maybe in some sense, and you can tell me if there's a fair characterization, has expanded even a little bit more. So the last year saw a lot of in-app purchase cases, including some that look like they might be litigated, some aggressive cramming cases, and then in the second half of the year, deception cases about claims of unlimited plans. And again, so the same kind of question I've been asking this hour, does this speak to a broader trend, to a kind of intentional effort for the agency to talk about some of these issues, or is this kind of status quo, similar things the FTC has been doing?
No, I mean, this is all by design. I mean, we're paying very close attention to the mobile ecosystem. Again, yesterday there was mention of what someone called the mobile revolution. What we're seeing, of course, is that increasingly consumers are migrating onto mobile, and we have to be monitoring the marketplace. We have to be where consumers are. And as consumers are using mobile devices for all sorts of things, we are going to be paying very close attention. So all of these cases are precisely because we want to make sure that the mobile ecosystem offers the same basic consumer protections that we have in the brick and mortar world. So we have been paying very close attention, in particular to issues that relate to some of you mentioned cramming, you mentioned some of these other in-app purchase cases that we brought against Apple, Amazon, and Google. We want to make sure, and those particular cases highlight one principle, which is we want to make sure that consumers are only charged for something that they have actually authorized. And so when you are presented with a bill that has third-party charges that you never authorized, we see that as a problem. And so we brought 2 actions in that area. So so this is all by design, and it's important for us to be monitoring the mobile space, and you're going to continue to see an effort in that area.
Great. So when we talk about privacy, of course, one thing that I really like as a student of this area is the international focus The agency has been a really, really kind of thought leader when it comes to interactions with Europe. You in particular have done a lot with APEC, looking across a different ocean. So I'd love you to bring us up to date on kind of the state of international privacy from your point of view. And if you're willing to opine, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the right to be forgotten developments in Europe, which of course isn't an FTC thing, but is something that's been very much in the international privacy space for the last year.
Sure. I think a lot is often made about the differences between the system that we have here in the United States and the protections that you see in Europe, for instance. But the reality is that in terms of the overarching objectives and at the level of high principles, we really have very similar and share very common goals. We want there to be basic protection, we want there to be transparency, we want consumers to have more control over their information, we want there to be accountability, we want there to be data security. But how one goes about achieving those goals, that's where you do see some differences. And there's no question that the international conversation has been a complex one, certainly in particular since the Snowden revelations. We at the agency have really worked very hard to engage in a very constructive way with our counterparts in Europe. And I think that we've made a lot of progress in that area, but it's a complicated set of questions and it's not been easy. And of course, Europe has gone through recent elections last spring and a change in leadership at the European Commission that is the commissioners that are dealing with this particular issue. So it's a complicated question, but in my mind, we have more in common than not, and we are engaged in constructive ways, and let me highlight two of them. One area has been with regard to the issue of the Safe Harbor framework, which is the framework that allows companies, American companies, to transmit data from Europe to the US. And there's been some criticism about how robust that framework is. We've been, and some in Europe have called for that framework to be eliminated, arguing that there just isn't enough protection here in the US. I think that we're going to, and we have over the course of the last couple of years, have had some very productive conversations about how to really improve the framework. And my hope is that we'll ultimately resolve that set of issues and shore that up. And so we're working with the Department of Commerce on this, engaging with officials, and we've just started to engage with new commissioners. My colleague, Commissioner Olhausen, has been to Brussels and is part of this dialogue. So I think I'm hopeful that we're going to ultimately, end up in a very positive place on that. But again, the conversation, can be difficult. Another area where there has been, I think, constructive engagement has been conversation that there, in Asia Pacific region, there is what are known as the cross-border privacy rule system. The FCC has been working as part of, with our counterparts in Asia to develop a system that really is premised on the idea that different economies, different countries have different cultures about privacy and obviously have different legal regimes, and trying to really grapple with that and understand how do you provide protection when you recognize that you're coming at it from different ways. So the idea behind this system that was developed through APEC was to acknowledge that, but to set a system in place that put in meaningful protections and then allowed the systems to interoperate. So we think it's really important that there be this interoperability. We have now been seeing engagement on the part of European officials with folks in APEC to try to bridge some of those differences. And in my mind, that's really what we need to do more of. We need to figure out how can these different systems really interoperate so that we can, again, encourage innovation, encourage continued economic growth, but at the same time provide meaningful protections. And to me, that's the ultimate question, because we have to just recognize these significant differences. Let me touch on the right to be forgotten, which is, of course, one example of how things, I think, are different. And I don't know if you want to maybe explain to the audience who may not be too familiar.
Right.
with
So
that.
the case of the European High Court that now says that you can request to search engines and other indices to remove information about you, even if it's truthful information, if it's old or stale, or if you have an argument that it should no longer come up on your at least first page of hits. It doesn't allow you to remove the original content necessarily, but it's targeted more at the search engines. And a lot of search engines have now had to set up, in the wake of this opinion, kind of institutions and bureaucracies and procedures for removing things. And lots of search engine links have been removed, in fact, in the last year. Yeah.
But the impulse behind that decision was this desire to, how do you deal with a world in which information is now just accessible with one click? In the particular case that led to that underlies this right. Mr. Costeja, a Spanish resident, a Spanish citizen, was complaining that a newspaper notice about a home foreclosure was basically coming up every time you searched his name, even though it was something that had happened, I think it was like 16 years ago. And so this issue of information just trailing us and being ever present and so easily accessible, that's something that they're really wrestling with and trying to balance this idea of privacy against other important values like free speech. And I think the decision tries to do a balance, and they reached the conclusion that the information was no longer relevant and therefore needed to be removed from the search engine, although not the actual newspaper, even though Mr. Costeja was seeking removal of both. But I think here in the United States, in my mind, that's not something that would really be readily applied. Here, to me, the First Amendment would be an obstacle to any expansive notion of a right to be forgotten. But at the same time, we do also have similar concerns about certain information that we think should no longer be accessible. So there are certain impulses and examples of this that you also see in U.S. law. One example, going to the Fair Credit Reporting Act, where in a credit report, for instance, information that is after a certain time, certain information ends up being deleted from your credit report. In addition, in California, you have protection provided to minors, websites removing certain information at the request of minors. And so I can understand the impulse that led to the decision in Europe. I do think that would play out very differently here in the US, and I do feel that the First Amendment is an important value. But I can understand the notion of and the quandary and concerns that underlie that decision.
So before turning to the audience for a question or two, I can't resist asking you a couple questions to give you an opportunity to have a little introspection about kind of the thing you're undertaking here as chairwoman. So this past fall, we saw the 100th anniversary of the FTC, and it seemed like a week didn't go by where someone in DC was celebrating the centennial, including the agency itself. I think you moderated a panel of past chairs of the commission. So, you must have had some time to reflect on the mission of the agency, the history of the agency, the evolution of the agency. What are some of the takeaways you took from this series of events?
It's been a terrific year. We were celebrating the passage of the FTC Act back in September of 1914. The agency opened its doors in March of 1915, so we've got that celebration coming up. But really, it gave us a real opportunity to really think and look back at that long history. And I guess time is short, so I'll just make a few observations. One is just a real appreciation for what the agency has really done over the decades to promote and protect consumers. And I think there are a few characteristics that stand out for me. First and foremost are just amazing staff. Over the course of the last year, when we were celebrating and talking about these issues, I had numerous discussions with staff members who'd been at the agency literally decades, 30, 40 years, who just had such dedication to the mission of serving consumers and advancing consumer welfare. It's just truly astonishing, and I think the talent that we have at the agency and the talent that we've had over the years, I think is just something to really acknowledge and celebrate. But there are other characteristics. One is our bipartisan culture, and Commissioner Olhausen talked about this yesterday. I really do think the agency has a particularly unique culture, and there are a few things that inform it. One is the fact that we are bipartisan, and we do seek to be consensus-based, consensus-oriented. The vast majority of decisions are made on a bipartisan basis. On occasion, there are differences of view, but we really work hard, and I see one of my primary roles as being, trying to build and forge consensus, bridge the differences so that we can reach a place where the majority of the majority of the commission, if not is unanimous, at least on a bipartisan basis, agrees is the right place. So I do think that the things that we do tend to be very balanced. We take a very flexible approach to the recommendations that we make, and I think you see that both in the reports that I've mentioned and the recommendations that we make, and even in the way that we approach our law enforcement. Also, the fact that we are primarily a law enforcement agency, I think that also gives us just a different mindset. We certainly do have rulemaking authority, but we do see ourselves with that mindset. Another very important piece that is very much a part of our DNA is research, and I think this is particularly crucial. The agency was created at a time when the social sciences were really coming into being during the progressive era. And we really think that it's incredibly important for us to study an industry. We have the authority under the FTC Act to compel the information so that we can learn and conduct studies and better understand industries. And on both the competition side as well as the consumer protection side, we've used that authority to really gain some important insights. In the healthcare arena on the competition side, I think we've made really tremendous contributions. And some of the issues that we've been talking about, I think we've really advanced and influenced the dialogue and changed the way companies in the marketplace is reacting. And I think you really see that when you look at data security, when you look at privacy. I mean, the agency was looking at a lot of issues that related to online commerce back in the 90s at a time when few were really looking at some of these questions. And I think we've had a very powerful role in influencing how the marketplace has evolved. Let me also just, in particular, make a comment that pertains especially to the students who are in the room, and that is that in addition to looking back, I've been thinking hard about how can we position the agency to continue on this great trajectory going forward, given the challenges that we face, given the complexity of the questions that we've been discussing, over the last couple of days. And one facet of that is to continue having just really tremendous and talented people. And it's important for us to bring into government people who have technical skills, who understand, who are engineers, who are computer scientists, who, and also to make sure that we can, communicate to those who are, entering these fields, the policy dimensions of the work that they're going to be doing. So I really do encourage the students who are here, and I know that this is obviously a mission that Paul, that you, Phil, and the center has to highlight the importance of coming to work and serving the public interest, coming to work in DC and working at these agencies, because we need to have that reservoir, that pool of talent in order to tackle these very complicated questions. We acknowledge at the agency that they're not easy answers to all of these issues that we've been discussing, and so how can we arrive at what are informed, good decisions?
So I really do want to give you time, but I really do want to ask this last question, which is, so two developments of the last year, and these really haven't been remarked on yet at this conference. Number one, the year 2014 saw a lot of pressure from minority advocates, women's rights advocates, to the tech companies to reveal demographic information. And what we learned was, probably astonishingly but not surprisingly, the number of women and minorities are vastly underrepresented. The other thing that happened last year is Terrell McSweeney was confirmed to the commission, meaning that the commission for the first time has 4 women and 1 man running. So is there a broader theme here that this agency that the technology industry looks to for a lot of leadership guidance and frankly law enforcement every so often is now a commission of 4 women with a chairwoman ahead at the same time that all this public scrutiny is on their own demographic practices?
Well, let me also mention that by coincidence, the heads of our 3 bureaus, our Bureau of Competition, Bureau of Consumer Protection, and Bureau of Economics, are headed by women as well. So female power. But look, this is an issue I think that really just plagues. It's not just Silicon Valley. It's an issue I think that continues to be a problem in various sectors. I came from a law firm where in big law firms you also saw at the partnership levels, lack of representation of women and minorities. But I think that it is more pronounced when it comes to the tech field, and we really are going to have to do a lot of work to deal with it. I'm very glad that a number of companies are saying, look, these numbers, they're disclosing the numbers, they're paying attention, they're investing in trying to rectify that. But it requires and it will require multiple, approaches to tackle the issue. Yesterday we talked about just education, and when you look at the data about when students sort of, when they really need to start thinking about entering science, math, and technical fields, I mean, you really have to get to students pretty early on. And if we don't make adequate investment in educating our workforce and ensuring, again, that opportunities are available to everyone around the country, I mean, as a nation, we're just not going to be making the strides that we need to make. So in my mind, I'm really pleased that in government, you do see so much, so many, and it's been a priority certainly for President Obama when he appointed the commission to have women, to have minorities in place. And I think we need to see more of that. But it's a systemic issue, and to me, it really all starts with investment in education, and also guarding against the unintentional biases that exist, and that a number of other prominent women, Sheryl Sandberg, have pointed out. Also pleased that at the White House that we have Megan Smith as the chief technology officer, and she's also been talking about this issue as well.
Great. Invoking the wiser rule, first question goes to a student. And I'll try and have 2 questions. We might go a minute. Yeah, right up here. Just wait a second.
Hi. In the past, we've heard about a lot of security breaches, specifically Target and Home Depot. Do you believe that maybe instead of the companies storing information about customers, do you believe maybe they should store less information so that even when there is a security breach, it's not as severe?
Yeah, this goes to the point that I was talking about earlier, and I don't want to talk about any particular companies, but I will. Let me. I can't talk about Anthem because we don't have jurisdiction over insurance companies. So to me, the issue of just good practices, good basic risk mitigation practices are crucial in this area. Not only do you need to have good security measures and reasonable security measures in place, but I think, again, you need to think about what data you're collecting. How long do you need to keep it? Just reading some of the reports about Anthem, obviously it implicated 80 million records of both current and former policyholders. They couldn't even really say how far back the information went. So I think time and again, it goes to show that companies need to be thinking very hard about their retention policies. In my mind, the less information that you collect, the less attractive a target you're going to be, and the less harm that will occur if, in fact, there's a breach that takes place. So I think good data hygiene is important, absolutely.
That's less attractive a target with a lowercase t.
That's right.
Okay, well, really quick question back there, over in there.
So, you highlighted the agency's increased interest in mobile. You also highlighted the benefits and flexibility of the Section 5 approach. So, given folks on the opposite side to me here, I have to ask, Chairman Wheeler has announced he's asked his fellow commissioners to apply Section 222 of the Communications Act to ISPs, including mobile broadband ISPs. Given that, given Commissioner Allhouse's comments and analysis of the common carrier exemption, what do we think about what the agency's authority would be if the FCC adopts the course it's planning to adopt on February 26th?
Let me just say that I absolutely support the goal of ensuring an open internet. I do also believe that, in my view, that the antitrust tools are not going to be enough to achieve that, and that you do need well-designed policies. But if the FCC decides to reclassify broadband service as a common carrier service, that will have an impact on the agency's jurisdiction. And I don't believe that it's going to have a significant, we're going to continue to bring the vast majority of the cases that we're bringing today in the mobile ecosystem. But I do think, to me, what this highlights is that there is a need to eliminate the common carrier exemption to the FTC Act. In my mind, that's and this is something that the Commission's been advocating for many years now on a bipartisan basis. It's a very outdated provision in our Act that no longer represents what is happening in today's marketplace and the way services are being delivered. And I think it's absolutely high time that Congress take action and eliminate that, because I do feel that the FTC has a lot of expertise, a lot of experience in this space, and we have a lot of value to bring to consumers, and I do fear that will be lost. So I am advocating for elimination of that exemption.
Great. Please join me in thanking Chairwoman Edith Ramirez.